You've spoken a lot about Hamas before, called them evil. You did a second video called Make God Avenge Their Blood, in which you said that Hamas, in some ways, they are worse than Nazis, which some viewed as a very provocative statement. Why did you say that about them?
The Nazis, I mean, here's a phrase I'll never use again, at least the Nazis. So at least the Nazis attempted to hide their crimes. So the Nazis obviously mechanized death. They had an Einsatzgruppen units that drove up to Jewish villages and would mow people down. And then they would bury them, and then they would try to hide the crimes. And it took the Nuremberg team years to undig all of that material. In this particular case, you have Hamas terrorists who are murdering Jews in their beds and then live streaming it and celebrating it and bragging about it and talking about how incredible it is and blasting that sort of stuff out. I mean, the videos that I've been showing on my show, a lot of them are coming directly from Hamas. I mean, it's Hamas that is taking contemporaneous video of this sort of stuff. And that's a whole new level of evil. I mean, to celebrate this sort of stuff, to treat it as a triumph. I mean, I think the thing that people really have to realize here is this is not a military operation. This was not a military operation. I mean, people have compared this to, for example, the 1973 Yom Kippur War. That was an awful moment in Israel's history when it was taken by surprise by the combined Arab armies around it. But that was a military operation with a military objective, which was to seize territory. This is not a military operation with a military objective. This was an operation directed specifically at civilians. And when we see death in Gaza, which we're going to see, and the images are going to be horrifying and terrible, it is important to understand that the reason that is happening is not just because Hamas crossed the border and murdered a bunch of civilians in their beds, but also because Hamas literally hides its weaponry behind civilians. Israel is currently, right now, sending out messages to Gazan civilians, telling them to get out of particular areas. And Hamas is sending out full-scale messages, telling people to ignore those messages and to stay where they are. Now, Hamas there's a reason why their headquarters were for years located underneath a hospital. I mean, it's what they understand that the West, again, has a peculiar narcissism where we think we would never put our military hardware below a hospital. That'd be insane. And so if Israel blows up a hospital, it must be that Israel's doing that because they're targeting civilians. Hamas knows that. That's why they're doing it. That's why they're doing it. They literally hide their rocket launchers behind apartment buildings in the hope that Israel will strike back and have to kill civilians in the process. Israel cares significantly more about civilian casualties in Gaza than Hamas ever has.
I mean, there have been so many horrendous images and videos. The poor girl from the music festival taken away on the motorbike was just bone-chilling to watch. I saw something on CNN yesterday with Jake Tapper where he's interviewing the relative of his grandmother, who was murdered, and Hamas posted the video of her being murdered onto her Facebook page so her family would watch it. I mean, when you hear that, it's sort of unconscionable. It's kind of beyond depravity. This is inhumanity.
I mean, Piers, you're in the business of words, and I'm in the business of words, and I've found myself repeatedly over the last few days unable to find words to describe the kind of thing that we're seeing. And again, we stretch, I think, in the West, and I stretch as an American. I think we all stretch to try and find, what would drive somebody to do something like this. And the answer sometimes is that they're I don't know how to say this otherwise. They are not like you. Hamas is not like you. They don't think like you. They don't have the same priorities as you. They don't have the same values as you. And that means that any attempt to buy them off is bound to fail. And this is inextricably intertwined with the history. I mean, the fact is, Israel turned over the Gaza Strip in 2005. There were no Jews living in the Gaza Strip since 2005. The areas that were attacked in this particular terrorist attack are not areas that are in the so-called settlements, the Shtachim, in Judea, Samaria, what's called the West Bank. That's not the area that was attacked. The area that was attacked has been sovereign Israeli territory since 1947-48. And that territory was attacked from across a border that is entirely controlled by Hamas, which has utilized pretty much every dollar that has flooded into that region over the course of 20 years from America, from Europe, taxpayer dollars that have been used to build up these terror capabilities. And every time there are cement shipments into the area ruled by Hamas, Hamas has used it to build terror tunnels. Pipes that have been sent into the area ruled by Hamas that were meant to build sewage systems have been repurposed and used for rocket tubes. I mean, it's utterly insane. And to try and come up with some sort of territorial solution, this is really just a territorial dispute. It is not a territorial dispute. It is a genocidal group that makes clear its own intentions. I don't know how many times people have to tell you who they are before we believe them. The reason that I've been saying that Hamas is genocidal for literally my entire career is because they say in their own founding documents that they are genocidal. It's not as though they're attempting to avoid culpability or responsibility for this. They are saying it out loud. They're begging you to take them seriously.
Well, they're also terrorists. I mean, let's just be crystal clear. This is an act of terrorism that we saw at the weekend, the worst since 9/11, one of the worst terror attacks in modern history. And yet you have mainstream media, the BBC in Britain, refusing to describe Hamas as terrorists. They call them militants. Even John Simpson, one of their senior foreign correspondents and editors, said it's not a journalist's role to call groups like Hamas terrorists. He says calling someone a terrorist means you're taking sides and ceasing to treat the situation with due impartiality. The BBC's job is to place the facts before its audience and let them decide what they think honestly and without ranting. That's why in Britain and throughout the world, nearly 500 million watch, listen to and read us. There's always someone who'd like us to rant. Sorry, it's not what we do, but I don't think it's about ranting to describe acts of terror as being committed by terrorists. And the New York Times apparently today actually changed the wording of a story they put online and changed the word Hamas terrorists to Hamas gunmen, as if they're almost terrified, literally, I mean, how ironic, of using the word terrorist. But what is it about mainstream media, two huge examples of it, New York Times and the BBC, that they won't just call this what it is?
I think that a lot of these groups are afraid of the political implications of just calling a terrorist a terrorist. I mean, when you acknowledge that the government of the Gaza Strip is in fact a terrorist government, that has some pretty large-scale implications for a lot of the political agendas at play. Because, of course, the great sort of dream of the West since at least the Oslo Accords has been that territorial concessions and that economic concessions would solve this problem. And when it turns out that an entire area is governed by a government that is in fact a terrorist government, is an actual terrorist group, then that has some pretty significant implications moving forward for the prospects in the region. And it also suggests that Israel has a moral duty, which it absolutely does, to protect its own citizenry by eviscerating that terrorist group from the planet. And the word terrorist has a definition. And that definition, by any stretch of the imagination, is fulfilled by what Hamas is. I mean, the BBC's explanation is so bizarre. It's almost like suggesting that if you found a man who had murdered his wife in an apartment and you reported on that, you didn't call it murder. You just said that someone was killed. A person was killed, and the person was convicted of murder, and you still said they're not a murder. We don't make judgments over here and use language like the word murderer because that would carry some moral implication. Well, yes, it turns out that murdering entire families, slaughtering entire families, burning them. I mean, some of the stuff that I've been tweeting out, which is stuff I'm getting again directly from first responders on the ground. I mean, just a few moments ago, I tweeted, I wish I didn't have to tweet out these photos, but I think people need to understand the consequences of failing to see evil for what it is. It was a photo of a group of people in a kibbutz called Kibbutz Be'eri, which is again near the border where 100 bodies were found, and they were attempting to simply escape, and Hamas stopped the car and burned these people alive. I mean, I don't know how you don't call that. What other goal could you have but to obscure the morality of the situation if you refuse to call things what they are? It boggles the mind. It truly does.
I mean, what also boggled the mind for me was Black Lives Matter Chicago, which had a Twitter account with 60,000 followers. They actually posted a caricature image of a paraglider saying, "I stand with Palestine." The paragliders, of course, were the ones who flew in and killed all the people at the music festival. What did you feel when you saw that?
I mean, unsurprising, only in the sense that Black Lives Matter as an organization had all sorts of solidarity statements about Palestine going all the way back to the original movement in 2014, 2015. But seeing them actively take up the imagery of an actual terrorist attack, that's what that is. Palestinians are not famous for their hang gliding. I mean, the only reason why that is the image is because literal terrorists use paragliders in order to murder civilians at an electronic dance music festival, by the way, attended mostly by people of the political left. I mean, those are not right-wing Israelis who are dancing at an EDM festival on a Saturday. That's not the way that works. It's only astonishing in either the moral blindness or the anti-Semitism. And at a certain point, the moral blindness becomes the anti-Semitism, because when you are celebrating active Jew murder and you are saying that that's solidarity, that's a pretty incredible thing. I'd also like to point out here that the argument in favor of Palestinian self-determination did not need to be threatened by any of these people. All they could have said is, Hamas does not represent Palestinians. This does not have any implications for Palestinian self-determination. Hamas is a terrorist group, and they ought to be eviscerated, and they ought to be replaced by a better government that could make peace. Like, none of this is particularly hard. The fact that they're lumping together Hamas with the Palestinian cause says an awful lot, and it doesn't say anything good.
In one of the videos, you say the only solution is for Israel to annex the Gaza Strip and kill enough sons of bitches to make sure this isn't a problem again. You say anyone who calls for a ceasefire is a terrorist sympathizer under these circumstances. And that got a lot of pushback. I guess this comes to the point of appropriate response. How far do you go? How do you isolate genuine Hamas from perhaps completely innocent Palestinians in Gaza, of which there will be many? One person called you a genocidal warmonger for that rhetoric. And there's a person called Mohammed Hijab in a video called in responding to Ben Shapiro on Israel. He says this.
First and foremost, I'll say, yes, we condemn any woman, child, or whatever it may be that's being killed who's Jewish and who's not a non-combatant. But why is it the case, Ben, why is it the case that none of your colleagues or you have been able to offer one single condolence, one single condemnation, one single word of sympathy for any of the Gazans that have been killed? Don't try and smear us. Don't try and slander us. Don't try and attack. Don't try and produce red herrings. And I think you're an ass, a jackass. And we're not talking about Hamas. We're talking about children here. We're talking about women here. We're talking about elderly people. You make me sick. You make me sick.
What's your response to that, Ben? I mean, that will be, I'm sure, a reaction you've heard from a lot of people. What do you feel about that?
I mean, my obvious response is, of course, I feel horrible for the people who are being held by Hamas in a state of tyranny for the past 15 years. Hamas was the elected government in Gaza in 2006. There hasn't been an election since then. All the people who are today ranting, as you heard Mohammed Hijab doing right there, I don't hear them talking about liberating Gaza from Hamas, which is the greatest threat to the way of life of Gazans on planet Earth. Again, I have nothing but sympathy for Hamas, for the people that Hamas is governing, or the people that Hamas is exploiting, really. I have nothing but sympathy for civilians there. Israel has to defend itself. I don't understand exactly what the expectation would be here. Is the expectation that because Hamas uses human shields, that Israel therefore has to go home and wait to have its people murdered again? Israel tried it the way that Mohammed Hijab and others would like. Israel literally pulled, in 2005, they literally pulled thousands of Jews out of the Gaza Strip. It was called the disengagement, and it was massively unpopular in wide swaths of Israel. They pulled out, they built a wall, and they basically said, go ahead and govern yourselves. And this is the result of that. You think anyone in Israel, no one in Israel wants to reoccupy the Gaza Strip. No one. That's why Israel has been studiously avoiding reoccupying the Gaza Strip since 2006, despite the fact that they have been living underground in large parts of Israel for weeks at a time because of rocket attacks that have been fired on a regular basis from the Gaza Strip into major cities,
but
including Tel Aviv,
let me ask you this, Ben.
Ashkelon.
In Gaza, you have 2 million people, many of whom are young people. Pretty hopeless conditions to live in. I think people would agree with that. Not much chance of getting out of there. They live in very densely populated areas. We know from in the last 24 hours that Israel controls water, controls energy, power going in there. Many would see that that is a control that Israel shouldn't have if you want to afford equal rights to people living in Gaza. And then it comes down to proportionate response and how you try and, like I say, how do you attack Hamas, given they're all over Gaza, living amongst the general population? How do you attack and isolate genuine members of Hamas, genuine terrorists, from the civilian population? And given that is almost impossible, clearly, what is a proportionate response to what's happened here?
Well, frankly, I don't believe in proportionate response to terrorism. I believe that the way that you stop terrorism is with wildly disproportionate response. That doesn't mean in terms of targeting civilians. It means in terms of killing as many terrorists as humanly possible and allowing them to dictate the terms of engagement by hiding behind civilians in areas that they are supposedly responsible for, means that the only option for Israel is to surrender to Hamas's hatred of its own citizens, its willingness to use its own children as human shields. No country worth its salt could ever do that. No government trying to protect its own citizens could ever do that. What exactly is the alternative option other than for Israel to try to kill as many of these terrorists and depose Hamas and hopefully help put in place some sort of international overseen community that would actually govern the Gaza Strip in a rational, reasonable way that actually maximizes the possibilities of its citizens? Israel, over the course of the last year, allowed some 15,000 work permits to Gazans. Many of those work permits we're now finding out were used by terrorists in order to cross the border. The fact that Israel controls the water and the power, the reason that Israel controls the water and the power is specifically because if they did not control the water and the power, Hamas would be right now holed up with the water and the power indefinitely. I mean, the fact is that the reason that Israel controls, for example, the sea border is because if they did not, there were attempts to ship weapons in from Turkey multiple times. The impossible situation in which Israel finds itself with regard to the Gaza Strip is mirrored only by the impossible situation in which Gazan civilians find themselves. And all of that, every single iota of that is the result of Hamas, which means unless there is a change in status in which Hamas is removed from power, in which someone else is put in charge, this is going to continue. Again,
but I would
Israel,
argue,
you think 10,000 Jews want to die going into the Gaza Strip in order to defend their citizens?
I agree with you, but I would also say that I think that it would also benefit any chance of a peace settlement that if Netanyahu wasn't in charge anymore. I mean, apart from anything else, this is an unbelievable breach and failure of security and military. I think part of that can be apportioned to the extraordinary social unrest that's been enveloping Israel since his cabinet, full of a lot of right-wing headbangers, frankly, some of whom have actually called themselves fascists, have tried to take on the judiciary and the Supreme Court. I don't feel comfortable about that. What do you feel about that? And do you feel that Netanyahu is the right person? Does it need a completely clean leadership now, both in Palestine and Israel, to try and get to somewhere approaching peace?
The democratically elected government of Israel has not had a change in policy, despite the fact that until very recently, Netanyahu was not the prime minister of Israel. It was a joint government run by Naftali Bennett, as well as by Yair Lapid, who's a member of the hard left who dramatically opposes Benjamin Netanyahu. Today, they formed a unity government between Benny Gantz, who's a member of the center left, and Benjamin Netanyahu, who's a member of the center right, Likud party in Israel. This is not, when it comes to foreign policy, the reality is that since the rejection of any peace deal by Mahmoud Abbas in 2009, when Ehud Olmert was the prime minister of Israel, there's been very little disagreement between any of the parties with regard to foreign policy because they do not have a peace partner. The Oslo process was killed by the Palestinians, and it was killed by the Palestinians when they rejected multiple peace offerings by Ehud Barak, by Ariel Sharon, by Ehud Olmert, over and over and over again, by Yitzhak Rabin, by Shimon Peres. Benjamin Netanyahu himself, in the Wye River Accords of 1998, handed over significant portions of the West Bank to the Palestinians. So you can say that Netanyahu's a problem. That's fine. But the reality is
I was really asking you whether
Netanyahu...
I was asking you whether you feel he is a problem, that actually all the division that's been caused by his attempt to usurp the power of the Supreme Court, as many people see it, all that division in Israel has actually diminished his authority, and that it's come at a time when you really need somebody with real authority.
Well, I mean, I don't think that right now that's really the question, considering, again, it's a unity government, and I'm talking to everybody in Israel, and all of those divisions heal up in a moment when your children are being slaughtered at the border, as it turns out. So, you know, all of the judicial reform conversation is a separate conversation. We can critique how fast they went in terms of this coalition. They went too fast. They scaled it back. There were serious divisions in Israeli society about what kind of power the judiciary ought to have. There are many people on both sides, actually, who believe the judiciary had too much power. There are a lot of people on both sides who believe the government went too fast on that. Internal political divisions have become completely irrelevant here. If Netanyahu were replaced tomorrow by Benny Gantz, which is what a lot of Israelis would hope for, if that were to happen literally tomorrow, nothing would change. Nothing would change. And the reason nothing would change is because, again, this is an issue. This particular issue is about Hamas. This has nothing to do with the constituency of the Israeli government. You could find the most left-wing person in Israeli politics right now, which would be Yair Lapid. You could put him back in the prime minister's seat, and he would be forced with exactly the same decisions that Netanyahu is faced with right now.